Hello, this is Eric Williams, and welcome to our latest edition of our UCS Tech Talk, introducing UCS Manager solutions for remote office deployments. I'd like to introduce our panel today. We'll start off with David Nguyen. If you don't mind introducing yourself.
Good morning. My name is David Nguyen. I'm one of the TMEs for UCS. Most of my main focus is in the UCS Fabric Interconnects, IOMs, and VICs.
Thanks, David. And Jason, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yep, sure. My name is Jason Shaw. I'm a technical marketing engineer focused on systems management.
And Tony Harvey.
Hey, I'm Tony Harvey. I'm a product manager in the UCS group, and I am responsible for the UCS Mini product.
Thank you, guys. Well, let's go ahead and get started with this tech talk. The main discussion points for today are going to be around our new platform we launched last Thursday called UCS Mini. So we'll start off with you, Tony. Be great to know a little bit about UCS Mini. What are the main use cases driving why we developed UCS Mini, and let's talk a little bit about some of the components. So let's start off with the main use cases. Why does someone care about UCS Mini, and why did we end up developing it?
Okay, so there were a couple of reasons why we developed UCS Mini. One of the main ones was we were talking to a number of smaller customers and a number of customers with branch and regional and remote offices, and they really loved UCS, but they couldn't get it to fit in that particular office because it was just too big. UCS as it stands today, prior to UCS Mini, is a wonderfully scalable system. It will go all the way out to 20 chassis, 160 servers. But if you only need 8 or 16 servers, then you're buying a lot of infrastructure up front that you're never going to use. So we targeted UCS Mini at that environment where we were looking for customers who really only need 8 to 16 servers in either small businesses, small, medium businesses, or we were looking at remote and branch offices. And then we got this third use case that started to come up as we started talking to customers about it, where they said, hey, I've got this app, and it needs to run on its own hardware because it's a really important app and we can't have it shared with anything else. So, we want to run it in our DMZ, for example, but we don't want a full UCS system in the DMZ. What we want is a smaller system, but we want to be able to manage it like UCS. And UCS Mini gives them that option.
No, that's awesome. So this gets a good understanding of it's really focused at those remote offices, branch offices, and maybe like a big box store or maybe a agency style model where you have a lot of distributed small offices with a small number of people. So I'm curious, a UCS, what I'll call a UCS Classic system, which is a set of 6100 or 6200 Fabric Interconnects managing those 160 servers like you talked about. What are the components that differ from UCS Classic that make up a UCS Mini domain?
So we tried to keep as much as we possibly could the same. So we wanted to use the same chassis. We did have to make some minor changes to the chassis so that we could actually do some of things like the cluster interconnects inside the chassis rather than outside. And then the other thing we needed to change was in the full classic UCS system, you have the Fabric Interconnects and then you have the Fabric Extenders in the back of the chassis. So what we did with the UCS Mini is we took the Fabric Extenders out and we took the Fabric Interconnect and shrunk it down so that we could fit it where the Fabric Extender was in the back of the chassis. So now we've effectively eliminated the FEX part. We still have the chassis management control IOM functionality, but we plug it straight into the back of the chassis, so the Fabric Interconnect is now part of the chassis. And then the power supplies,
just to make sure I understand the question, you basically took all the functions that a traditional 6100 or 6200 Fabric Interconnect and those 2200 IOMs and put it all into one environment and shoved it in the back of the chassis. So it basically does now 2 functions for that smaller environment, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And it's really not doing the Fabric Extender functionality because we no longer need that. What it's taken over from the Fabric Extender is all the chassis management control that used to be done on that Fabric Extender. And now the Fabric Interconnect effectively just directly connects the ports into the back of the service.
Yeah, great. So you're, again, I'll let you go on. You're talking about the power supplies.
Yeah, and the power supplies, one of the things that we got some strong feedback on in the remote and branch office is that we needed to be able to support 100 to 120 volt low line voltages in the chassis. There'll be some limitations on that I'll talk about in a little while, but we can actually power that UCS Mini chassis up from 110 volt.
No, awesome. So my curiosity is, has a lot of similarities with UCS Mini to the UCS Classic. What are some of the new and innovative features of this new style of Fabric Interconnect, and how does it differ from the previous generations, the 6100, 6200 Fabric Interconnects that we've done?
So the real major difference from the 6100 to the 6200 is that what we had to do to fit it physically into that fabric extender slot on the back of the chassis is shrink this from a 3 ASIC system down to a single ASIC. So we also had to get some new processor technology from our partners at Intel that we could actually drive the full-blown UCS Manager technology onto something, again, physically so small. So we really had to upgrade all the technologies in there and bring it out. But from a management perspective, what we wanted to make sure is that it behaves in exactly the same way as the classic UCS system. It has the same capabilities, it's got the same XML API, it's got all of the same management functionality that a standard classic UCS has. It's just been shrunk down a bit to the much smaller system.
Interesting. So they really the IOM Fabric Interconnect, all that software that we have inside of the traditional environment's all the same. Is there any other differences between, let's say, a mini solution and the classic solution? I mean, it looks like some of the architecture is the same. I'm curious to see what other lineage, if there's any other lineage that they have.
One of the lineages that we come from is we took some of the ASIC solutions from the Nexus 3500, specifically the Nexus 3548. One of the ASICs in there is actually the ASIC that we use to do the majority of the switching in the system. That also, the other thing that this is the first of the Fabric Interconnects you'll see with a QSFP on it, so it's got a 40 gig link. Currently we only use that as 410s, but in theory, we could later on take that to a full-blown 40 gig link if we wanted to.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. So a lot of new innovation, a lot of new changes, but still a lot of similarity to what we've had. So we're carrying on that same type of capability and management solution we've done for the past.
Yeah, very much so. Obviously, we needed a new version of UCSM to go along with this because with a new ASIC that changes the underlying NXOS code, and we also wanted to add in some slightly different features. We were trying to sort of cut it down a bit to some of the functionality, not some of the functionality, but some of the feature sets to more closely match it up to a remote and branch office. And over time, we'll expand it back out again. So one of the things that we did, for example, is we limited it to the V200 M3 blade in the initial release, just working on the principle, that we sell all of the 100 M3s, and to be honest, that two-socket EP space is what's most likely to be used in the remote and branch office and for those kinds of applications.
So given that domain count will be much higher with UCS Mini, given that the number of servers is much reduced to a classic environment that supports 160 servers, what is that management strategy looking like with Mini as you scale out? Like a big box store that may have 800 or 900 or 1,000 stores across the United States, how are they going to manage the domain count to be that high? Given some of our largest customers have 300 or 400 domains, now you can go past that really quickly with a big box store with hundreds to thousands of sites.
Yeah, so from a management perspective, one of the key things was we wanted to keep the XML API as common as possible. And in fact, and I'm sure Jason can back me up on this, I believe that when we gave the first units to you guys in the T&E group, you were able to use all of the PowerShell scripts and stuff like that they just worked on the UCS Mini. And the only thing you needed to do was a little bit of bounds checking just to make sure that you didn't ask for server 160, because that really wouldn't have worked very well. But that's about it. So on top of that, what that means is that UCS Central and UCS Director can work as well. And UCS Central is a really big, powerful solution in this environment, because what UCS Central allows you to do is take all that wonderful stuff that we do with service profiles on UCS, abstract that up to a higher level, and then do that from the center, and then push all that management information out from the center to the branch, so that you can pretty much manage the branch remotely. That means you can have the hardware delivered and installed, and then somebody can do the service profile configuration remotely. And that means, from a customer perspective, the big advantage there is that you can guarantee that all of your stores will be identical. They won't clash on MAC addresses. All of your pool stuff will work, but all of the policies, all of the service profiles, all of the setup will be done identically across every single store. That's a huge thing in retail, because that's one of the things that they demand for things like PCI compliance. How can you tell us that every one of your stores is configured the same? Good question. I don't really want to answer that yet. Now you can. Yes, it's done. That's how we do it. That's what UCS Central is for.
Right. You can just templatize that deployment of every store, like you were saying, by using the concepts of global service profiles, global policies, and pools. That central management solution, all managed with UCS Central. I know Jason's going to talk a little bit about that here.
I'll give you one customer example. We were talking to a customer about how they use C-Series. How do you manage firmware upgrades? And what they said was, well, we have 2,000 stores, and we employ 2 people, and they spend their entire life driving and flying between stores, and essentially, in English, and I don't know the right term for this in the US, but for any of our English listeners, it's like painting the 4th bridge. When you get to the end, you start again. They just go round endlessly in a loop. When they finish the last store, hey, new upgrade, get back on the road, guys.
Well, thanks, Tony. Let's switch over to David. Bring you into the conversation a little bit, David. I think it would be great to be able to show a little bit of the hardware. I mean, something we haven't done on these Tech Talks is actually, show what the hardware looks like, show what the new Fabric Interconnects looks like. Do you have any pictures or details you can share on the actual hardware itself, what the chassis looks like, what the fabric looks like, Fabric Interconnects look like, etc.?
Yes, I do. Actually, my partner here, Jason and I, instead of trying to do PowerPoints, we actually took a camera and went to our labs and did a video capture of the chassis and some of the equipment itself. So let me start my share my QuickTime real quick and kick that off. So if you look at it, it's pretty much very similar to the old classical UCS, very similar, right? You still got the 6RU system. You have 8 slots for half-width blades, as well as it can be a full-width blade as well, right? On the bottom, you still have the same 4 power supplies that's available. And the big thing that we want to point out is that the units that you use within your classical system can be also used in this new chassis here. The reason why we had to do a new chassis, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, is when I start showing the IOMs, and we'll talk the details of it, why a new chassis had to come out. But it's not a major difference between the two, but it's just enough that it allows you to operate the Mini. And so here I'm just pulling, had Jason plot a power supply in here. And what we want to show is that it's a dual voltage power supply, right? As Tony mentioned, the importance of having a dual voltage power supply is that, one, we want to make sure that you can use the same power supplies in the existing data center, as well as have the capability to use the same power supply in a remote branch office.
Yeah, and it's just quickly stepping in, David, there's one thing I want to comment on this. If you look on the left-hand side where it's, you look at that input, 100 to 120 volts, 15.5 amp max, you start to work the numbers on that at 100 volt, at 120 volts. What that will tell you is that it will drop from what was a 2500 watt output on the right-hand side, 200 to 240 volts. That drops to 1300 watts at 100 to 120 volt range, and that's a significant drop in power output. So what that means is that you could be limited in the blades that will actually power up, and this is one of the differences that we had to put into UCS Mini. We had to change some of the power supply code, not the power supply itself, but the power supply management code to recognize that 1300 watts and to add in the capability to recognize that as blades were powering up, we had limited power output. So we might get to a point after maybe, depending on blade configuration, 4 to 6 blades, where maybe the 7th blade wouldn't be allowed to be powered up because we wouldn't have enough power to be able to power that blade and keep redundancy. So that's something that we definitely had to do a lot of work on, and that's something that people need to be aware of, that when you do run at low line voltages, you could run into some limitations on the number of blades that will actually power up.
That's correct. And the other thing that we also want to make people aware of is this is a dual voltage. So it's from a sparing perspective, you only need one power supply, which is the new power supply, which allows you to plug into the original, your classical data centers, as well as your remote branch offices. And based on your input, then it will adjust accordingly. And that's the same thing when it comes to our chassis as well. If you look at it again from the front side, you won't be able to tell the difference between the classical versus the new chassis here. But if you look at the PIN number here, or the product identification, you notice that we have a AC2 behind it. So the 2 in itself will denote that it's the newer chassis.
Yeah, and as David said, what we'll be doing over time is phasing out the old chassis and standardizing on this new chassis so that you'll just have one chassis in your environment. And one of the things that we're doing right now is going back and making sure that chassis works with the older revisions of UCSM. So not just 3.0, which is the UCS Mini version, or 2.2, which is the current shipping version, but 2.1 as well.
No, that's great. Thanks, guys, for all of that. So one question on the chassis itself, David. What's some of the differences with the actual chassis and the backplane? I know we did some things there to support the UCS Fabric Interconnects, the new 6300s. What are some of the differences there as well?
Yeah, so let's take a look at the back side of here. Again, there's not much difference. You still have your fans and your power distribution unit here. Okay, so in itself right there, those are still the same, and those are still, can be used between your classical and your and this new chassis. But now, if you notice, as Tony mentioned, that what we did is we shrunk the form factor size of the Fabric Interconnects. Okay, we made the Fabric Interconnect into an IOM size form factor, right? So if you look on the left-hand side, you will have one, and the other right-hand side, you have another. What we did is basically we took the Fabric Interconnect and the IOM, and we just merged it into a single chip. So which basically your switch on chip onto these IOM blades themselves. Okay, from the UCS Manager perspective, nothing's changed from that perspective. You still have an FIA and FIB to give you a redundant fabric. Okay, if you guys are familiar with the classical Fabric Interconnects, there are a cluster link between the two Fabric Interconnects, which we call the L1s and L2s. And what that's usually used for is basically for your your database synchronizations between the two Fabric Interconnect. Well, if you look at here, if you notice, you look at the ports here, we only have 4 ports plus a QSFP and some management port and console port, which we'll zoom in a little bit later to show you a better look. where we can do the L1s and L2 connections. We could obviously have an option to have being used one of the uplink ports, but then it takes away the whole viability of ports that you can use as your network connections. Okay. Another thing, it doesn't look too good to have a cross connect from that perspective, from a cabling. So what we did is we did the backplane of the chassis in itself, where we added some traces in between the L1s and the L2s for the Fabric Interconnect to the synchronous database. So that's one of the big differences between this chassis and the older chassis. But again, what I really wanted to highlight and highlight again against this chassis and the old chassis is from a hardware perspective, it's very backward compatible, right? So the systems like the server blades that you use on your older chassis can also be used in this chassis as well.
So one question here. I mean, really, this chassis is identical minus the backplane traces to allow cluster communication between the FIA and FIB with a 6324. Could you use this chassis as well in a UCS Classic environment? Well, this chassis will work both for UCS Mini and UCS Classic, correct? Going forward.
That is correct. That's a very good question. This chassis will be able to use in your classical environment. Because we use the same form factor, all you have to do is remove the FI IOMs out and put in your standard IOMs, the 2200 or 2208 XP modules, and this will become the regular chassis that connects up to your standard Fabric Interconnect. Okay.
So on all intents and purposes, it's the exact same chassis we had before, just with a couple traces between the two to enable the cluster interconnects. Cool.
That's correct.
So, yeah, really, truly it's an updated chassis. It's not a replacement chassis or a new chassis. It's just a really minor update that allows us to use it in the UCS Mini environment and is completely backwards compatible with the existing UCS environment.
Yeah, so from again, from the sparing perspective and everything, what you think about now, you just have one chassis that you can use for both of your remote branch offices or your mini data centers, as well as your traditional large data centers.
So I've noticed some of the ports are quite different on a 6324 versus a 61 or 6200 Fabric Interconnect. Can we drill down a little bit more of what were the real differences, like be able to actually see the Fabric Interconnect as well?
Yeah, so here we actually pulled out the 6324, which is the new model for the FIOM for the Mini. Okay, so really up close, if you still have your standard management ports on the left-hand side, so it's your tri-speed ports, which is your 10, 100, 1 gig connections. On the far right, you have your serial console port, right? And the times you connect into serial console port is really at the initial setup stage where you actually can configure, the management interface, the VIP interface, and the basic password. Once you set that up, then you can connect into your network and go through UCSM to configure the remaining stuff. We also added the USB slot. Right now, currently, it's only for firmware upgrades, so you can plug a USB in with firmwares, and then you can definitely do firmware upgrades locally from the system itself. So it kind of saves time of downloading everything to local PCs. You can just have a USB stick with the correct firmwares. Now the actual networking ports, right, that we have available for you. So let's talk about the four SFP ports right in the middle. Okay, so these are the unified ports. Okay, so unified ports, very similar to the unified ports in the classical, will support 10 gig, 1 gig interconnections, your fiber channel connections, 8 gig and 4 gig, as well as FCOE. You also can do appliance ports on it as well. And of course, you have the option to do server ports. Server ports meaning connecting downlink. So what are the options from a server port perspective? We'll also give you the ability to do a direct connect of a C-series into these ports themselves. Okay, so when you change different port types from Ethernet to fiber channel, again, this will require you to reboot the system. One small difference between the, not from the functionality, but just from the personality of it or the behavior, is that if you understand the classical Ethernet on the fiber channel, on the 6162, we always do the fiber channel connection or the fiber channel ports on the highest number order ports first, right? And they always had to be done in pairs. Well, within the Mini, right, for this here, we have 4 ports. We give you more granular control. We can do on a per port base. So you can do a single port for fiber channel and have the remaining 3 ports as Ethernet ports. Also, the difference is we also start the fiber channel ports on the lowest number of ports. So if you start from port 1 to do your fiber channel port, then port 2 as your next one, okay? So that's the little bit difference between the classical and with Mini here. Now let's move over. You have questions? Now let's move over to the QSFP port, which is right next to it, which I kind of highlight a little yellowish orange here, which we call the Scalability Port. Okay, so this connection is actually a 40 gig connection, but then we have a breakout cable which allows you to break it out to 4 individual 10 gig connector ports. Okay, and then these ports has different functionalities or behaviors, right? The first one again is server ports, which gives you ability to connect to another C-series directly. You also can do FCOE as an uplink or a storage port, so you can do a direct connect storage ports, as well as an appliance port for, let's say you have like an IP-based network attached servers. So from a port perspective, this gives you a quite ability to change, connected to different types of networks, and it has a lot of ports available from a server port as well as an uplink. And from a network connections, you can do port channels as you would expect with any traditional switch.
So it looks like it has a lot of the same capabilities and a lot of the same flexibility we have in a classic environment with Mini. What are some of the actual boot options you can do with the server with all those configurations? I know in classic we support things like boot from SAN, boot from my SCSI, etc. What are we supporting day one with UCS Mini?
So the same boot options that you have in the classical will be available within the Mini as well. So you can do a direct connect with a SAN storage box and boot from SAN from there, or if you want, if let's say this Mini's connected into like a DMZ zone and you have a SAN network, right, SAN A, SAN B, you can definitely connect into that SAN network and also boot from a remote storage device. From IP base, if you have a NAS, you can configure an appliance port and do your standard NFS or CIFS configurations and boot from there.
That's great. So curious, you've talked about this QSFP. I've never seen that before, and I think that's something new from a UCS perspective. You have a picture of what that looks like, and can you talk a little bit more about it as well?
Yes. So yes, we do have a QSFP picture for you. So one of it's on one end is we have a QSP, which is kind of highlighted in red. It's a little bit wider than the actual SFP connections. And on the bottom, we have 4, where it breaks out to 4 individual 10 gig interfaces, right? So these, we have one for TwinX, and we also have another QSFP options where you can do with cable, with fiber connections, with your standard LC connections, right? LCSCs. So again, from the QSFP port, this will connect into your Mini. And then the yellow ports on the bottom will have the capability to connect directly into a C-series, the VIC adapters where you can do your standard single wire direct connections, as well as if you have, let's say, a storage device like a NAS, you can connect a 10 gig port there to connect into that as well. You also notice that I mentioned a second chassis, which we have a future support, which we don't allow you to do today with the current software with the 301, but in the future we'll give you the capability to scale it even further and connect a second chassis with these ports as well.
Oh, that's great. It's a great overview. I'm curious to know, how many servers or blades or rack mounts do we support in this domain, today with the current release, and what are we looking to support here in the future?
So today we just released the 301C, and so currently what you can connect today is up to 7 rack servers. Okay, so if you really remember the number of port counts that we gave you, so we gave you 4 10 gig, 1 gig ports. So you definitely probably want one to connect to your network, right? Otherwise, this will really secluded deep system. So you definitely want to come out use one of the ports to connect to your network, which means that you have 3 remaining ports on the 10 gig ports, which you can connect into your NEC series servers. Next, we have the scalability port. Now, the scalability port, again, gives you additional 4 10 gig ports. Again, so that means you can connect additional 4. So it gives you a total of 7 rack servers that you can connect into Mini today with the current software release. So the current servers that we are supporting for direct connect into Mini today is the C220 M3s and the 240 M3s.
So, David, that would be a total of 15 servers then with the 8 in the chassis.
Yes, 15 total within the system itself. Thank you. Yes. So with 8 within the chassis, then with additional 7, you can connect out from a C series rack servers. Will give you 15 total. Now, in future, we'll give you a capability to connect a second chassis within the system. So with the second chassis on the Mini, the second chassis will basically, you need to use your standard 2200, 2204s, and 2208 IOMs. So these IOMs will be, act as basically a child to the FI 6324 that you connect to your parent. Okay, so where you connect the second chassis against is off of those QSFP 4x10 10 gig breakout cables, which I kind of highlighted with the orange cables, right? With the orange line here. So you can use one connection to connect it to second chassis, then have the 3 remaining connections into a direct C series. You have flexibilities how you want to do the connections, right? This diagram is to show you what's the maximum connections allowed. But if you need more bandwidth into your second chassis, then obviously you can connect the second 10 gig into it and just reduce the amount of 10 gig or the rack servers that you want to connect into the overall Mini solution. Okay, so you can have 1, 2, 3, or 40 gigs coming out into the second chassis, what you see fit that's required between the second chassis from a bandwidth perspective. Again, from a 10 gig on the 4 SFP ports, you still have those available to connect into your rack servers, as well as if you don't need that many rack servers, you can connect into your standard LAN connections or Ethernet or fiber channel connectivity. Okay, so with the future support, again, it's not in this current release, but in this subsequent software release, we'll make an announcement to let you know when this capability comes in. But if you were to have the maximum connections available, since we have 2 chassis with 8 blades, 8 slots each, that gives you 16 slots, and then we have additional 4 connections. You can have up to 20 servers within this Mini solution, which is quite a lot of servers for the solutions that you can see that you have. Second thing I also want to point out that I didn't mention before is that the 40 gig connections to this that if you want to use it does require a license. So it will be a license requirement for the 40 gig, right? Whether you use it for a direct C series or for future connections into your second chassis, or to use in like a appliance port or an FCOE connections, that will be a license port, okay? But the 4 SFP Plus ports, those already come with the purchase of the system itself. Okay, so there's no license requirement. The license is only required on the 40 gigs scalability port.
So a question on some of the connectivity that you have. I'd be curious to understand what are some of the common ways people are going to connect their storage and their uplink networking into this. What are some of the topologies that we expect people to use when connecting UCS Mini to their storage arrays as well as their northbound networking?
Sure. So from a connection perspective, from an IP-based storage where you have iSCSI or a NAS, you're doing NFS, something like that. The traditional, what we will have is, again, what you will see is either you have one Ethernet connection coming out each FI and going up to a single Ethernet switch. So, for example, I have FIA on the far left side. So let's look at the diagram on the left side, and I have an FIA on the left and FIB on the right, and 2 Ethernet switches above. Okay, so the FIA, you can have 1 connection or 2 connections coming out of it and connecting to the Ethernet switch 1. You can do port channel, you can do a single channel. From that perspective, it's just depending on the customer's requirements of how they want to connect it. Most customers will probably do port channel from that perspective, just to give a logical connections. From the FI perspective, because we still do active forwarding, we still manage, we go in end-host mode, so it doesn't really matter from that perspective. We'll still utilize both links regardless if it's a port channel or non-port channel. The only difference between a non-port channel and a port channel is if one link fails, obviously the traffic will fail over to the second link. It's just that we won't do a gratuitous ARP for a port channel connection. Okay. Then from the iSCSI connections, it can connect off of the switch themselves. So that's one option. Or the other option is that you can have the iSCSI connection or the SAN direct storage device connect directly into the UCS Mini in itself. I didn't have a diagram here, but just imagine if you only have the Ethernet switch as your outbound connectivity to your network, and then you just want to have a local storage. You can definitely have the option of just extending connection the iSCSI or the NAS devices down to the Mini in itself. On the right-hand side, there's another different type of connection. It's just a little bit different in the sense that instead of a single home connections where an FI just connected to a single switch, we have an FI just split across between two different uplink devices, network switches, and you can do port channel there. You do that just it gives you a little bit of a difference, a high availability in a sense from a network connection from a given FI. You no longer have a single switch, you have two switches, which gives you a better availability from that perspective. From a SAN perspective, what we have here is basically we also give you a direct attach capability as a SAN storage connection. So on the left side, we have a direct attach, which means that from FC or FCOE, you could connect into UCS the Mini, right? So the ports that you could connect for SC, again, is only limited to the unified ports, which again are the 4 10 gig SFP plus ports. The SFP plus ports are the only ones that you can do FC connections. But from an FCOE, we support FCOEs and all the ports, both on the SFP plus as well as the QSFP 4x10 breakout cables. So you have an option of doing that. So when you do FC or FCOE, obviously we'll do local zoning on the Mini in itself. The second option is if you want to do an FC or an FCOE connection into your SAN network, right? So in here, one caveat is we don't support end-host mode for FC storage today in the software release, but we will have that capability in the future release. So currently, when you do FC connection to a SAN network, that means you have to be in switch mode. Okay, and we actually disabled the changing into end-host mode from an FC perspective. Okay, so from FC you will do switch mode, which means you'll get the zoning from your SAN network. Okay, so again, you have the option of doing FC or FCOE. Again, FC again is limited to the SFP ports, and the FCOE gives you the capability. We also have the capability from FCOE connection from the SFP plus as well as the QSFP breakout cables. So with these two different type connectivity, again, from SAN boot connections, SAN boot options, you still can do your iSCSI boot or your SAN boot into your blades.
Oh, that's great, David. I really appreciate your time on these. This is a lot of really good detail for a lot of the folks. Before we switch over to Jason, I just wanted to let everyone know that's watching this live as part of the Google Plus Hangout. You feel free to ask questions, via the event page, and we will be more than happy to answer them as we go along. For folks that are watching this and recorded, after we've done the live recording, feel free to go to communities and cisco.com/UCS and ask questions. So let's switch over to Jason. Jason. I wanted to talk a little bit about the software elements. We've talked a lot about the hardware elements, the new 6324 Fabric Interconnect, and the the updated chassis and whatnot. I'd like to talk a little bit about UCS Manager and what maybe has changed with it, or what hasn't changed with it with this new platform we've introduced?
Sure. A couple things I will reiterate that we heard earlier. So, for one, we're running the 3.01 software release on UCS Mini. It's a platform enabling release, so it's supported only on the Mini platform. It actually will not load on 6100 or 6200 series Fabric Interconnects. It follows the same release train as the 2.2.1 software release from a features functionality perspective. But when you look at managing UCS Mini, it looks very similar. There's a common look and feel for how you manage Mini versus how you manage a UCS Classic. Ultimately, we've got the same UCS code base as a UCS Classic system. The same APIs are in place. This allowed us to make it really easy to integrate UCS Mini into Central as well, which I'm certainly going to cover as well. And really, under the covers, the only sort of changes to the API or changes to the model are to add additional classes for that new piece of hardware, that PHY IOM.
So it's really no different than us adding a Blade or what have you to this. We're just adding new classes to support the new types of hardware that we have. It's still the same XML database. It's still the same concept that we have. We've talked about in previous versions where we talked about a data management engine and application gateways and that underlying UCS management software running in the Fabric Interconnects to manage the whole infrastructure. That all is pretty much the exact same as a UCS Classic. It's just we've changed the form factor from a physical perspective, correct?
Very true, very true. So I've got a few demos I'm going to cover today. I'm going to start out with showing you, you saw all the hardware earlier. We pointed out all the ports on this new hardware, what the Mini looks like. I've got some demos here that let us look at what, how UCS Mini is represented in software in both UCS Manager and we're really going to talk about Central. And I think what you'll see is UCS Central is really the primary method of managing UCS Mini, and that's because you're so quickly going going into an environment where you're managing multiple UCS domains. Again, the scalability of Mini, especially in a remote office, branch office. You're very quickly going to likely deploy many of these and need centralized management. Not want to have to manage individual UCS managers, individual references of server configuration, pools, and policies and such. It's going to make so much more sense to have a single place to store all that server configuration, and then let UCS Manager really just be the execution engine, for when you deploy those global resources into these remote UCS domains.
So you mean basically you're just using UCS Central to do all the configuration management for your pools and your policies and those templates, and then just pushing those down to each of the environments that you're managing, like as you're adding a new data center and a new remote site, let's say, Las Vegas or wherever your particular corporation is starting to expand. You really rack and stack the server in that new branch, but then all the configuration is driven remotely from Central down to that particular branch, correct?
Absolutely. Yep. And I think what you'll see in terms of new features and functionality we've built into Central is we built in the ability to do a lot of that remote programming. Allow someone to quickly do the rack and stack. You get that quickly imported into UCS Central, and then give you the ability from UCS Central to do something even as programming the remote ports, for example, configuring the SFP ports for a particular role, server role, network uplink role, and such. Really give you the the level of control you need to allow UCS Central to be that that single place to manage many remote domains. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my video that I have. Great. So actually, starting out here, this should look very similar. In David's session earlier, we were pointing out all the management points or the physical points on the PHY IOM module. We saw the management console port. There's our USB interface. There's our 10 gig SFP ports, our fixed connections. There's our scalability port as well, and you can see a very common look and feel from a UCS Manager perspective. We've got our serial console. This is the hybrid view, by the way, which I'm a big fan of because you can kind of see all of your connection points and a nice visual indication of whether everything's connected properly. We even break out the backplane connections here, and these ultimately are those traces from the blades into the, in this case, the FEX, or a component of the PHY IOM today. So even though we've got a converged piece of hardware, that is performing the function of a Fabric Interconnect and an I/O module, we've got a breakout for both of those components individually from a software perspective, and you'll see a little bit of that here. So as I navigate through, into the PHY I/O module, very similar to UCS Manager Classic, when you go inside your I/O module on the chassis, I've got, again, all my backplane port connections and a visualization of whether they're up or down. If I go into the Fabric Interconnect, now I'm looking at the Fabric Interconnect portion of the module, where I can see my fixed Ethernet ports. You can see the Scalability Port as well, broken out. I can configure these ports, from a UCS Manager perspective, just like I have in the past. On my Scalability Port, I can break that out. Again, see the 4 10-gig connections that can come off of that Scalability Port, and also configure those independently if needed. So a very common look and feel, for folks that have been managing UCS Classic. No big changes from a software management perspective. All the same capabilities and the same level of intuitiveness. In fact, here's the unified port configuration tool. And if you remember David mentioning earlier, in the UCS Classic environment, the slider typically goes, I think, from right to left. Your fiber channel ports are going to start from the right-hand side, require you to configure them in pairs, whereas what we've provided here is a slider from left to right, anywhere from 1 through 4 ports of ports of fiber channel uplink. I think a lot of customers in a branch are going to use far fewer than 4, but the capability is there. On the Scalability Port, there are fewer options. You can't use that as fiber channel uplinks, but you still have the ability to, again, configure them from both UCS Manager. And I'm going to jump into Central here shortly. Lastly, this last point here is just showing you that these are the resources running on this particular UCS Mini. You can see the green dot on the left-hand side. These are all global service profiles. So this system is managed by a UCS Central.
So let's talk a little bit about that UCS Central management. I mean, we've talked about this is this particular use case for UCS Mini is targeted to a remote office, branch office kind of environment. And like we've said, in a big box corporation or a company that's an agency model that could have hundreds to thousands of branch offices or stores, managing each domain independently without a central management solution just isn't going to scale, in my opinion. I'm curious to understand where UCS Mini management fits into UCS Central. Where does it compare to a classic system? I mean, are they managed the same? And really, how does Central? What's it look and feel like for Mini compared to a classic domain, or again, is there any difference at all?
Sure, I think you're going to find it's very similar. And again, given the size of the domain with UCS Central, today up to 15 servers maximum. If you're deploying, let's say, an environment with a lot of branch offices, and you're deploying presumably many branch offices at a time, again, you're going to quickly realize the benefits of UCS Central. Having, again, multiple instances of UCS Manager, multiple instances of those pools, those policies, those templates, different, server configurations to have to manage in each of those domains. UCS Central is quickly going to make a lot of sense to deploy and make your life much easier. What I've got here is I'm about to log into that exact same UCS Central that's managing this particular UCS Mini. And again, all the resources that you may have saw earlier were global. When I zoomed in just a moment ago, I think there's a total of 27 domains being managed. A lot, and we actually differentiate in that platform column whether they're UCS Mini or UCS Classic. So yeah, and once logging into UCS Central, you can very quickly realize what type of systems you have. And as we break out into the domain group settings, I've got this broken out into root level and then 4 domain groups that correspond to regions in the United States, Eastern, Pacific, for example. And inside of Pacific is my Las Vegas UCS Mini, which is the system that we've been looking at. And what I want to show here is just, from a look and feel perspective, as you drill into the hardware, just like a UCS Classic, I'm going to go inside the UCS domain, inside the Fabric Interconnects, inside the fixed modules of my UCS domain, in this case my PHY IOM module. I'll be able to see both the Ethernet ports as well as the scalability ports. And again, as I flip back and forth, I've got the same view in UCS Manager. What I want to point out here is how we can even configure from UCS Central, configure these Fabric Interconnect ports. These are set as server ports right now. I'm configuring one of them to uplink, and I'll switch back into UCS Manager, and that change gets invoked fairly quickly. We'll see the status change in UCS Manager. Once that port has been changed and referenced in the model, UCS Central will pick up on that and change its status as well. So when we flip back into UCS Central, we'll also see that role of that port change from server to network. So again, you've got a lot of control right from Central, and the goal, I think, is really to long-term allow Central to do all aspects of that remote, even the initial setup on UCS Mini. And for folks that have been following the release train of Central, we've been adding more and more features along that track.
No, this is a really good good start of the demo. Really to show how you can do some of that day zero configuration. I think it'd be fun to actually go see potentially how you can start to look at doing templatized deployments in a particular branch, assuming you have a new environment that you're building out and whatnot. Is that something you could actually show us as well?
Yep, definitely. So my next video here, again, same UCS Mini system. We're going to dig into a little bit on how these, how these remote workloads are actually, deployed. So I just sort of zoomed in on my global service profile listing. There's 288 total global service profiles being managed by this, UCS Central instance. And I've got a set of organizations broken out. And in my organization called remote workloads, and that's really where these global service profiles, a lot of them are sitting. I've got sub-organizations within that org for each of my UCS Mini environments. So if I look at the Las Vegas sub-org, there are my 8 global service profiles that we saw earlier running on my UCS Mini. Again, my Las Vegas UCS Mini. And if we dig inside one of those service profiles, we see that it's actually spawned from a service profile template. So let's click on that and kind of dig into the properties of that global service profile template. And when we actually go and look at, I believe it's usage, we can actually see that all 288 of those global service profiles are actually being spawned and managed from one global service profile template. So I've got n number of minis in here. I think you can see from a sub-org perspective probably 7 or 8 different sort of remote locations where I've got remote global service profiles, and they're all locked in and linked to one updating global service profile template.
So that's pretty interesting. So I mean that you really are showing in this particular environment UCS Central managing both a data center environment with UCS Classic, and 9 different sites, one including Las Vegas, and then having one template being able to manage all of my, in this case, your VMware hypervisor environment. So you really have one source of truth, one service profile template that's being pushed out across everything, and then I'm assuming you're taking advantage of things like the VLAN aliasing capabilities we have, so you can have different sites have different VLAN IDs and whatnot, but they all just have the same name in the actual service profile itself, correct?
Yep, absolutely. And as we drill into some of the domain group settings, we can see how even though we've got UCS domains, minis, classics, in these remote locations with presumably different configuration required in those remote data centers. I've got a couple of examples of how we're leveraging policy resolution in different regions. So, for example, I've got a structure, a domain group structure of root, followed by a set of subfolders based on the region of the U.S. Again, Eastern, Central, Pacific in this case, and then inside of Pacific, I've got a bunch of Pacific-focused domain groups. Again, Las Vegas is one of them. I've got policies sitting in different branches of that hierarchy. So, for example, I've got my backup policy sitting at the root level for all of these UCS domains because it makes sense to have a common policy for that particular task. I've got time zone NTP actually set at the Pacific or Central or Eastern region where it would make sense for one or many UCS domains in that region to consume that particular policy.
So in this case, you're basically tailoring the domain group configuration more from a geographical perspective, where you can have different, maybe Active Directory or authentication settings per site. You have one east and west, or in this case, a time zone and whatnot. You can really tailor it either at a fully global level or at a more geographic, or however a customer may choose to define their domain groups.
Absolutely. Firmware management, your AD configuration, great example. Call home, there's a lot of administrative policies that are things that an administrator has to do, one time or maintain within a certain geography. And those are great examples of things that you can build into Central. And when you bring up that new UCS Mini environment, have the right configuration automatically applied and centrally managed in one place rather than in many.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I mean, so one thing I was going to ask as well is, when you're doing that registration process, are there ways to automate a domain to go to a specific, specific domain group, or do I have to go back into Central and do that?
Absolutely. In fact, in this particular UCS Central, we're leveraging some registration policies that, based on the IP address of the UCS Mini that's being registered, it can automatically be assigned into the appropriate domain group. And then based on in fact, the screen that you see now, this policy resolution control, when I'm registering UCS Mini or UCS Classic with Central, if I'm selecting global in my radio buttons, I'm going to automatically inherit that configuration that's been created in Central for me. And by using that registration policy, I'm going to get brought into the appropriate domain group, and then again automatically inherit the configuration contained in those folders in that domain group hierarchy.
Well, that's pretty cool. I mean, so you can actually go and be automatically put into the right domain group based upon those registration policies. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think you can do those based on the location or site set in UCS Manager, as well as the range of IP addresses and such.
Correct. There's a number of ways to invoke that automatic registration. And again, the value add is, as you see here, I've got policies that are grayed out, that are not configurable by the user, that are being centrally managed, so that I don't have an opportunity for config drift across these domains.
No, that's really cool, because then it makes that day zero configuration really easy, where I register it, I get all of the configurations that I need for the administrative settings, and then I can start applying those templates and creating service profiles and putting the workloads on top of it as well from that central location and such. So one question I have for you as well, for people that want to learn UCS Mini and such, what's the best way to learn? Are there things available? Can they download Central? Can they download a copy of Mini, and could they put those together to start managing a virtual remote office environment? What would be your recommendations to learn, Jason?
Absolutely. We have a platform emulator available for UCS Mini. It's based, again, on that 3.01 software release. That's a free download on Communities. I'm sure some of the links that we'll have towards the end of this session will link to those locations. UCS Central as well, a free download. I would absolutely recommend folks go out to cisco.com, download UCS Central, begin playing with that today. You can use one or many UCS Classic platform emulators, UCS Mini platform emulators, and register them into Central, and build a sandbox environment to begin, planning your deployment.
So that's cool. I mean, so basically they could build out a virtual mini environment with Central and start to learn how it would manage that at scale without even having hardware today. And then if they like that, then they can move on and start purchasing the hardware. So that's awesome. And the cool part about it is it uses all the same servers that we have in a classic environment. Has all that same software. The UCS Manager looks the same. UCS Central manages a mini and a classic environment the same way. So it's more of another snowball going down the hill. It's the same stuff. The same ingredients we've been developing against for the last 5 years are part of UCS Mini. It's nothing different really at all. It's just a different little form factor, but the management's exactly the same.
Very true.
Well, I want to thank my panel that we've had here. I want to thank David, I want to thank Tony, and I want to thank Jason for your time. I want to thank the listeners that had listened live, as well as the listeners that are going to listen, after this has been posted onto YouTube. I want to thank you for your time. I want to make sure folks that have questions or want to learn more about UCS Mini or UCS Manager and UCS Central to go to cisco.com to learn more about it, as well as communities.cisco.com/UCS to be able to ask folks like myself, David, and Jason further questions that we may or may not have answered in this particular Tech Talk. Again, I want to thank everyone, and I encourage you to go to communities and watch our future Tech Talks coming up in the coming months. Thank you.